Now that I have the image set up, the montage image, I'm now going to introduce the existing images so that we have them in our main content. So I'm going to take HTO1, I'm just going to drag it onto the montage image, and you can see the places there, and I can shove it around the image. Now if you look closely, you can see that as I move the image, it snaps onto the guides that have been placed. So if I now bring that image to there, you can see I can lock it into that side guide and also the horizontal guide. So that is now in the right position. And the only thing that I would probably change here is I would rename the layer so that it is main hovercraft image. Okay. I can then repeat all of these steps with the supplemental images. So as I drag them in and place them, okay, it now gives me the option to move, and you can see that as I move the images around, they snap onto the guides. So you can see that as I move from guide to guide, they snap on, which is again useful in the fact that I've set up the image with all the guides. It allows me to easily place all of the content. So as I continue to add all of these images, you can see that using the guides I can drag on all of the content. Now that I have the content placed, you can see that all of the images have been placed there, and I could probably call these supplemental images 1 to 4. So I could use copy and paste to rename each of the images. If I name the images with the same, if I name the layers with the same name, it's not going to give me an error. It's just going to show them up as the same name. The precedence that I've given each of these layers is not really an issue because they're all side by side. There's actually no content sitting on top of each other, so it's not that one layer will be obscuring another. And now that I've placed all of these images, you can see the preview, the layer preview, to showing where the content is in relation to the overall image size. This is just a preview, but it's quite useful for us to be able to pick up where the image actually is. Now that I have all of the images placed, I'm now going to create the text area. So if I was to take the select tool, tool, if I start outside the image, GIMP will still let me select outside the image, but I'm going to use the guides as a snapping function. So now I can pick up on the guides, and now I have an area that I can select, but I'm going to use the fill tool. Now before I use the fill tool, I am going to want to add a new layer. So if I add a new layer, call it text fill, I click OK, it creates the new layer for me. The selection is still active. The selection that I've just placed is still active, but now that I'm working on the text fill layer, I could come along and I can use the color picker to pick out a slightly grey color, or maybe if I wanted to continue with a kind of red theme from the hovercraft itself, I could pick maybe a red grey hue from the options, and I click on fill, and I fill inside that area there. Okay. Now that I have that selected, I can now come along with the text tool. And the text tool, I'm going to flip the colors so that I actually type in with the text that I type will be white. If I was to choose a font, I can scroll down through my font lists and I could pick something reasonably okay. Let's say the OCR text if available. The size of the size of the text in pixels is quite useful because I can now compare how high this border is. I know that's only 50 pixels high, so I'm going to put in text of 40 pixels high. Now that I'm going to draw, I'm now going to, let's say www hovercraft. I click on close, and it now places that text, and if I was to move that element, I can now reposition whereabouts. So now you can see that it's snapping to the guides because I'm so far away. If I was to hold down the control key, I could move in, okay, and if I was to use the space bar, it will allow me to pan the image, and now I can still use the move tool and I can position it approximately horizontal to where I want to go. Then you might say, well, this image here is, or this text is quite big, but it's not the size of the text that's important, it's the concepts that we've applied. Now if I look at the overall layering system, you can see that I have the initial main image on its own layer. I have the supplemental images. Okay. I have the text fill, and actually the fourth image is slightly out of sync. So I have the text fill and I have the hovercraft. Now in this case here, the text fill and the hovercraft text are actually quite important. The precedence that they have is quite important, because if I was to take the text fill layer and raise it above the stack, because it's a solid color, it now overwrites or hides, basically because the red-gray hue is a solid, it hides the content behind it. So in this case here, having the text on top or higher in the stack than the background to it is quite important. The last thing that I will do is I will take the content of each of the supplemental images and I'm going to add a small border to it. If I take the layer that I want to edit, I will right click, okay, and I will scroll down to the very bottom and I'll choose alpha to selection. And the alpha to selection will select only the pixel content of that layer. If you have a look closely at the layer, you'll see that the elements shown in black aren't actually black, there's just no pixels there. So this option of alpha to selection actually looks at what pixels within the layer of this image are actually full of a color. Now only a very small portion are, it's only the portion of the image that I placed. So it creates a border that I was able to use. And you can see here slightly, again I've miscalculated, possibly I've missed maybe 100 pixels out. So the images are overlapping slightly, but that's an issue that I should have noticed a short while ago. That would be something that you can consider. You could possibly make the canvas size wider, you could move these guides out, you could move the content out just a little bit further. And actually that's what I'll possibly do. I'll move the content of these supplemental images on either side just out slightly, and I will move just so that the border doesn't get in the way, you don't see the border overlapping. So I'll reapply this alpha to selection, and you can see that I have just the pixel content selected. Now I'm going to press D on the keyboard. D on the keyboard resets the colors to their default black and white. The reason why I do that is I can kind of add a black border to the outline, and the idea or the tool that we use for outlining is called stroke. So I will go to the edit pull down menu and I will choose the stroke selection option. It will now give us the option of stroking the selection here, which will be that highlighted area with a line, and I'll put in possibly 2 pixels here. Solid color, the color that's currently set up as the default, will be applied, and if I was to now deselect, okay, and if I was to choose a different layer, okay, notice that I've chosen the wrong line type, so I'll undo that and I will apply the stroke to be with a line rather than a dashed line. So I'll try that again, okay, and then I will deselect, and you can see now that I have a solid line placed around the border. So I'll repeat that for all 4 supplemental images. Right click, alpha to selection, edit, stroke selection, and I will repeat that for all of them, and you'll see we just add a small border. That's actually adding pixels to the layer that the image is currently on. So it is a destructive technique. So now if I click there, and now possibly I'm going to turn off the guides. Sorry, I'm actually going to turn off the guides, and I'm going to deselect everything. And now you can see that the image, the supplemental images have had a border added to them. Okay. If I was to select that whole layer and move it up and down, you would see that the layer the content has a border placed around it. So you can obviously move the elements after the event if you possibly wanted to take the supplemental elements and move them around slightly so that they have a new position, then that's fine. So that ends this particular tutorial. It's the concepts that are important. The idea of arranging the image size appropriate to the content you're going to use. Being able to take in images from other sources, copy their information into a new image, rename the layers as they are added. Then we're going to use the selection tools to create a tagged area, use the text tool to create some logos or to add some logos or text that is required, and then possibly treat the supplemental images in a certain way. To complete this task should not take that long, and also there's an additional exercise to repeat a new montage or a different montage with different content in an additional folder to go along with this.